that seems to be working, so you can all hear me. Thank you very much. So, welcome to this official launch of Legal Voices for the Future. We are all delighted that you have decided to join us tonight. My name is Janeta Sadilakova, and I'm one of the founding members of Legal Voices, and I have a huge privilege of giving a few opening remarks tonight. My fellow founding members are, in order, as they are seated next to me, Matilda Graham, Margarita Cornelia, Hattie Owens, Mingzi T, and Elnas Amiri. We are also supported by the Law Society of England and Wales, and we want to extend our heartfelt thank you to Doughty Street Chambers for allowing us to hold our opening launch on their premises. Now, the idea for Legal Voices for the Future was born almost 2 years ago and has grown in both ambition and reality ever since, and every time we, now the founding members, have met and talked. There were a few realizations that motivated us to pursue this idea further until this day. The first realization was that the modern legal education does not cover the issue of climate change or indeed other environmental and societal dimensions in its core curriculum. This means that young lawyers embark on their legal career without knowing or with ill equipment to be able to see the impact of their career choices and decisions on the environment, on the planet, on the society. The second realization was that the young lawyers are largely isolated from one another once we leave the university and qualify. We often pursue our careers with some mentorships from our colleagues and our friends, but very rarely are we connected to one another. Now, this means that young lawyers often feel lost in their careers, guided only by people whose experience is very often different from young lawyers' everyday reality. And third, and building on the two previous realizations, we have also realized that without the right education and the right connections, the legal profession risks becoming complacent in some of the worst planetary and societal injustices. And Legal Voices is here to address all three of these gaps. We are here to enable anyone to gain the high-quality education on climate change and other planetary and societal issues. We are here to enable anyone to connect to their peers and feel empowered to become the maker rather than the victim of their career. And we are here to make sure that the legal profession we are the proud members of will keep making us proud in the years and decades to come. We will do it. We will do this all by holding monthly knowledge sessions in person and online for those who cannot be here in London, which will cover various important planetary and societal issues. And given the current state of international affairs, it comes perhaps as no surprise that in the first year of our operation, we want to focus on climate change. At the end of this launch, Mingzi, one of our founding members, will give you more details on how these sessions will run, where you can find more details about us and other next steps. Now, by now, you might all be asking, who is this young lawyer I have been referring to? And also, why young lawyers in the first place? I'll take each of this point in turn. At Legal Voices, we have no definition of a young lawyer. We want to be as inclusive as possible, and therefore we want to leave it up to anybody to define what young means for them. For example, you can be young in age, or you can be young in heart or in your knowledge. You might have come to the UK and decided to qualify here as a lawyer, or you may have decided to qualify as a lawyer having left your previous career. All of these are examples of being young for us. And we want to leave each and every one of you with the full autonomy to define what young means for you and whether it is enough for you to join us. At Legal Voices, we also truly believe in the profound power of the youth. And we have really good reasons for it. Young people, be it young in soul or age, have been involved in some of the most important events in the recent and contemporary history. One of our founding members, Elnaz Amiri, comes from Iran, where, as I speak, we are witnessing some of the most articulated calls for political change in decades. People gathering on the streets, chanting powerful slogans for life and liberty, are all young and powerful in their own ways. Although no one knows how these protests will end, young people will always be remembered as those who, driven perhaps by compassion as much as passion, have decided to risk their lives to bring about a change they desire to see in their society. I myself come from Slovakia, a small Central European country which was ruled by socialism before 1989. The event that marked the end of socialism in the country is not well known. It is called the Velvet Revolution, a name chosen by historians to mark a very peaceful nature of this revolution. Back then, people gathered on the streets of many Slovak cities and showed their discontent with the regime by raising their hands with their house keys above their heads and jingling with them to show the Communist Party that it was time for them to go. Many of these people were young students, young professors, and young retirees. And two of them were my parents, the two portraits on the slide. Now, they were freshly out of the university with a newborn daughter, my older sister, and they took part in what nobody back then knew would be a peaceful transition from socialism to democracy in Slovakia. They were very scared and they were unsure, but they joined their peers in what they believed would create a better and more equal future for their children. Now, I wanted to make this opening speech a bit personal, because I think this is personal. None of you is here today in your professional capacities, as representatives of your law firms, NGOs, government agencies, chambers. You are all here today because you have decided that you care about the planet and the society. Your decision to become members of Legal Voices and embark on the journey of building connections and community and gaining knowledge in important societal issues and environmental issues will be your own personal choice. And you will make that choice knowing that you might not be able to see the fruits and the gains of that choice. Very much like my parents during the Velvet Revolution in 1989, not to improve their lives, but so that me, my sister, and my brother can enjoy equal opportunities in an extremely unequal world. We are all here today to effect a change that will reverberate throughout our profession and the society in the years to come. In closing, it is my great pleasure and great honor to welcome you today at this launch event. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for joining us. And we're in what we all believe will become one of the most important fora for young lawyers to connect and learn from one another. Before I pass the microphone to Alistair Cameron to give a few opening remarks on behalf of the Law Society, let me give you a brief overview of how this event will unfold. So after Alistair has spoken, we will have first session, which will focus on what we call impact snapshots, which are essentially small overviews of how climate change is impacting various areas of law. This session will be facilitated by Matilda, and she will give you more detailed instructions very soon. Our second session will be a small group discussion on a set of questions about climate change, which we have chosen intentionally to get you thinking about the first topic of our focus. This session will be facilitated by Hattie, and again, she will give you more details about how it will run very soon. Finally, Mingzi will close this launch by outlining what's next for Legal Voices, including the structure of our knowledge sessions and the topics of the first 3 sessions. You will also get an opportunity to sign up for the very first knowledge session, which will take place in a month, and we will answer any questions you might have. Afterwards, we would be delighted if you could join us for some drinks, snacks, and discussions, which we hope will be accompanied, if we can get the tech work, by a climate change playlist, which was specially curated by Mingzi. But we can't promise that one, hopefully. And to finish, once again, thank you very much for coming and welcome to the launch of Legal Voices for the Future.
That's a hard one to follow. So I am delighted today to attend the launch of Legal Voices for the Future and provide the support of the Law Society of England and Wales. And I'm really looking forward to attending and learning from the future workshops, some of which hopefully will be held at the Law Society. I was delighted that Legal Voices for the Future founders approached the Law Society, as until recently I do not think it would have been a legal organisation you'd have necessarily approached to support a climate change initiative. In 2020, the Law Society, alongside a number of large city firms, were protested by lawyers for Extinction Rebellion for their inertia on climate change. Responding to the protest, the Law Society established a climate change committee and published a climate change resolution in 2021, which urges all solicitors to understand and act on climate change through the advice they provide to their clients. The resolution urges solicitors to continue legal education on matters pertaining to climate change in recognition of the pervasive impact of climate change on society and legal practice. The Law Society itself also commits to support solicitors to be fully informed on how they might act to mitigate the climate crisis. At the end of the day, you could say that the resolution is another pledge, another declaration, or maybe as Greta would put it, more blah, blah, blah. However, what lies behind those words is a call to act, just as Janetta was saying, but specifically for legal professionals. The word I want to hone in here on is act and what that means. A fairly undignified quote I found after Googling from a Yahoo Answers thread said, actions are the act you perform on something, expecting something to happen, while reaction is the response to that is given back. When thinking about climate change, we often feel that our actions do not have reactions in impacting the crisis. No doubt that is due the challenge at hand and fear of the potential consequences the climate crisis might bring. We might feel empowered as individuals or consumers, perhaps through changing our habits or lifestyle, or we might even feel empowered through civic action. Even then, we might not even feel that our actions have a reaction though. However, we often forget that perhaps the area where we're all most empowered for action is through our professional work or through our agencies, law students, academics, or engaged legal voices. You're probably here today because you want to take action, but by attending, you are already doing so. Learning about the intersection between your own specialty, the law, and climate will lead to a whole host of reactions which might not be immediately apparent or you might not even see the impact of. I've often found that people and legal professionals want to take action on climate, but do not, or they may not even thought of how to, and on how they're professionally empowered to do so. Ultimately, they are ignorant to the opportunity for change, which makes total sense because we think climate action sits in the abstract behind closed doors at conferences or large corporate buildings, or in the minute through recycling coffee cups or something like that. It also makes sense as there's no universal playbook for climate action at the individual level. The reality I've found is that a lot of climate action sits in the mundane, a composite of lots of different actions taken from a range of people which build into something bigger and often unexpected. This occurs when an individual identifies the opportunity of change and recognizes their own sphere for influence. For a property lawyer, that might be restructuring a contract to incorporate green lease clauses. For a trainee, it might be through joining a sustainability committee at their law firm. For a commercial lawyer, it might be flagging risks to the client on climate change they otherwise might not have been aware of. These opportunities, of course, won't come every day, but the reactions from them, most of the time, will take on a life of their own. The lease that the property lawyer advised on might lead to an energy efficiency retrofit, otherwise that wouldn't have happened for a building that will stand for many years to come. The trainee on the committee might help introduce a positive program of sustainable learning at the law firm, which will have its own impact for many years to come. The commercial lawyer's advice might cause the corporation to rethink their long-term strategy to incorporate climate risk. The activists who protested the large law firms and the Law Society in 2020 did not walk away that day realizing the wave of reactions and consequences they had brought about in the legal sector, a lot of which I have had the privilege of gaining insight to. For example, at the Law Society, we're also now working on producing regulatory guidance for solicitors on climate change. a major unpredictable reaction, which in part can be attributed to the action taken that day by protesters. Similarly, you will not know yet the potential reactions from joining Legal Voices that might mitigate the climate crisis. I know that might seem quite abstract today, sat in this hall, feeling probably quite disconnected from the climate crisis, but I believe Legal Voices for the Future will help provide you with the knowledge to identify the opportunities for change and action as a legal professional. They might not all be immediately apparent, but as I said, today you are here to take action. And as the Yahoo Answer user said, those who take action expect something to happen. So I really look forward to acting by attending the future workshops and supporting Legal Voices for the Future. Congratulations from the Law Society to the founders for launching this important initiative. I'll hand over now for the impact snapshots. Thank you.
Thank you, Alistair, and thank you, Janetta, for those really powerful openings and a reminder of what unites all of us in this room, which is a keen sense of feeling the urgency of the climate crisis and a motivation to use our professional practice to address it. When the six of us first began discussing Legal Voices for the Future, one of the themes that arose was that there really is no one way to be a climate lawyer, and we wanted to promote an awareness that this isn't a discrete environmental issue, but an all-encompassing one which will affect all legal practice areas and every sector of the economy, which is why we landed on the idea of impact snapshots for the launch event, designed to provide you with an impression of the wide variety of areas and topics that this comes into, and hopefully whet your appetite for topics for future knowledge sessions. Each of the six of us will present briefly on a topic that we find interesting, and then we'll invite you attendees to discuss with each other any others that you can think of. In the spirit of bravery, we'll invite one or two of you to feedback what you've discussed. And I'm going to begin by discussing employment law, which might not be the first area that comes to mind when you think of climate change and the law, but in fact there are some really interesting areas emerging. For example, clients may begin to approach their lawyers to request drafting for employee contracts or handbooks that embed their net zero targets. Clauses might include a sustainable commuting policy, a holiday policy which rewards domestic holiday destinations or the use of sustainable mode of travel, employee climate engagement provisions requiring the employer to provide a range of climate education interventions, and ESG-based performance conditions for employee incentive awards. A company's green credentials are becoming ever high on the list of priorities for prospective employees. In fact, it has emerged as the top personal concern for Gen Z, according to a recent study by Deloitte. And it's a way in which competitive employers will be keen to set themselves apart. On a completely different note, whistleblowing will also have an important role to play in the climate crisis. A whistleblower who reasonably believes that they make a public interest disclosure that the environment has been, is being, or is likely to be damaged by their employee is protected under the Public Information Disclosure Act 1998. If they are treated badly or sacked for speaking up, they have a remedy with uncapped damages in the employment tribunal. And this is hugely important because workers will often be the first to spot when their organisations are likely to pollute or damage the environment. As more organisations come under pressure to disclose their impact on the environment, so the risk of greenwashing increases. We will rely on whistleblowers who are the closest to the source of concerns to call out these harms. And if you want to find out more about climate whistleblowing, Margarita and her colleagues at Doughty Street are holding an event on that subject next Wednesday, February 6 to 7, at which point I'll hand over to you, Margarita.
I'm going to stand, even though I could have done this by sitting, because I didn't want to take up too much time, and I'm going to ask you to participate. So I'm a barrister here at Doughty Street, and I specialise in human rights, and I'm trying to specialise in particular in climate litigation. And I'm here to say a few words about how the climate and ecological crisis and human rights law interact. So I'm planning to ask you a set of questions, and if you'd like to, please stand if your answer to that question is yes. Please sit back down after every question and rise again if your answer to the next one is yes. Now, those on Zoom, I'm sorry, the fun is not as much, but you're very welcome to stand up and sit down or raise your hands. So starting with an easy one, have you in recent years changed your behavior in response to inordinate heat, inordinate rain, or any other inordinate weather condition? Thank you. Do you worry when you're walking, cycling, or spending time outdoors that the air you breathe smells or tastes toxic? Thank you. Have you thought, and this one's a bit more difficult, at least once, about whether having a child is reasonable, or have you worried about your ability to guarantee a safe future for your children in light of changing planetary conditions? Thank you. Have you felt sad, distressed, or guilty about the ever-decreasing number of wild species, plant or animal, that coexist with us? Thank you. Have you ever been to a protest to push for greater climate action and ambition? Thank you. And finally, are you scared that others elsewhere, perhaps relatives, perhaps friends, perhaps people you have worked with or know of, are at great and perhaps greater risk than you from the effects of climate change? Thank you. Now, I wanted to ask you these questions because to me, and it seems to you too, the climate and ecological crisis is not a faraway concern. It is a direct, personal crisis which we are all facing. It is a crisis that affects our very identity as human beings, living on this tiny, complex, unfathomable living system which is planet Earth. The climate and ecological crisis is inherently a human rights crisis. It affects our ability to live our lives, our decisions about how we live them, our interactions with the natural world, our mental health, our means, our work, our understanding of the world, and our relationships with other human beings here and far. These are all issues that might engage our rights under Article 8 of the European Convention of Human Rights, for instance. Our ability to protest without fear or repercussion, peacefully, I should say, affects our Article 10 rights. Our ability to breathe clean air is potentially an issue under Article 2 of the European Convention on Human Rights. And yet, enforceable human rights regimes still do not universally recognize the right to a healthy environment as a fundamental precondition to our ability to exercise and protect each and every one of our other more well-known and well-recognized rights. Yet at once, human rights law is an incredible tool to push for greater recognition of the action which we need to take to meaningfully and genuinely tackle the disaster which we are heading into at full speed. To me, it is a silver lining to the horrendous lack of action which I witness every day. And I hope that together, a new generation of activists and lawyers might be able to take a stand to make the incisive tool, which is human rights law, their own, and to fill this space which needs to be filled to achieve real, rapid, and rigorous change. Thank you, and I'm very much looking forward to meeting you and hopefully working with you as well in future. And I'm handing over.
So I will not be standing up. This happens when you are not rehearsing the event, and then people do things differently, but I think that's okay with all of you. So hard to follow that, right? Because human rights is such a prevalent topic, but and it will be a bit more boring. I'm going to talk to more of you, or those of you who work in commercial practice, and my snapshot focuses on consumer protection law. And I want to just build it up on how do we see the impact of climate change on consumer protection law. So we all know that advertising and marketing is a way that our purchasing decisions as consumers are impacted. And therefore, consumer protection law comes in to protect us from making our purchasing decisions based on misinformation or even fraudulent information. And climate change, therefore, comes into consumer protection law through a phenomenon that all of you have heard of, greenwashing. Now, there is no legal definition of greenwashing, but it can be loosely defined as a practice of making a false or misleading statement that creates an impression which is not accurate about the environmental footprint of a product, of a particular product. These claims then deceive consumers and impact our purchasing decisions and therefore purchasing power of our money that moves the economy. Greenwashing can take form of climate change statements, but it also can take form of biodiversity statements or plastic statements. And this is why some commentators prefer to call climate greenwashing statements climate washing. So you might have heard the term climate washing, specifically referring to product descriptions that misrepresent or potentially misrepresent climate footprint of a product. Now, interestingly, we have seen a crackdown by both regulators and litigants on climate washing intensify last year after COP26, where many corporations made voluntary net zero pledges, net zero by 2050, and then halve emissions by 2030. I truly believe that all of these were made honestly and with good intentions. But what then we have seen is when the ambition of the statement met the reality. And many of these companies now find it really difficult to draw a line between their ambition and then what they realistically can do on the ground. And in their marketing, what we have seen is they often rely on the ambition more than the reality. And this is exactly where a role of a commercial lawyer comes in, to make sure that your client's ambition and the realities align in what they say to the public. So as a lawyer, you could do very, very particular things, such as review the wording of a proposed campaign that your client wants to push out to the consumers, or also slogans or even jingles, to make sure that what they say actually is substantiated in facts and research and reflects what can be realistically achieved in the next 20 to 30 years. So that is just a very short and perhaps very uneventful impact snapshot from commercial law practice, but as I said, it's hard to follow human rights law. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeanette. It's also very hard to follow barristers. But I think what I'm talking about, which is access to information, transparency, and the availability of data, flows quite nicely from what Jeanette was talking about in terms of pledges and ambition and the reality that might sit behind those. And I think for that reason, access to information, transparency, and data availability really do matter in the context of climate change. And from a legal perspective, these issues arise across a range of practice areas. It's relevant in different ways in both the public and private law contexts. The policy rationale underpinning transparency and disclosure requirements, as we've sort of already heard, is really clear. Adequate understanding of and so meaningful practical responses to the challenges posed by climate change rely on access to good quality information. We see this in terms of public awareness of the scientific reality of the situation, and I think the reception and responses to the IPCC's reports are really testament to the importance of this scientific information getting out into the public domain, making sure people know what's actually going on. And another aspect of the importance is accountability, so both of public authorities, including government, as well as private entities. In terms of public authorities, there's arguably already a pretty robust existing framework around access to information about the environment. So the Aarhus Convention, which is the relevant aspects of which are implemented domestically through the Environmental Information Regs 2004, establishes requirements about what environmental information public authorities must make available to members of the public, and this is regulated by the Information Commissioner's Office. In terms of accountability, the Office for Environmental Protection's recent report, full disclosure, I'm a lawyer at the Office for Environmental Protection, their recent report on government's progress in improving the natural environment in line with its 25-year environment plan targets. A recurring theme in that report was the lack of useful recent data that was available to the OEP in doing that analysis, and a key recommendation the OEP made was that data must be made available that are adequate for understanding underlying drivers and trends in environmental improvements. On the private side of things, what companies know and what companies do really matters. So the recent controversy around what Exxon knew about climate change back in the 70s and 80s, and in particular, the precision and accuracy of its understanding really underlines this. we see increasing regulatory obligations on disclosures of climate-related financial risks aimed at supporting investment decisions in a move to a low-carbon economy. And then in terms of accountability, again, we see also an increase in shareholder action, much of which is aimed at increasing companies' transparency about their responses to climate change. So these are just some of the ways in which access to information, transparency and disclosure connects with and is important in our response as lawyers to climate change challenges. And I think it's interesting because of the way that the central principle, which is essentially transparency is a good thing, kind of cuts across different practice areas and can have implications for lawyers and their clients across various sectors, remits and spheres. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Hattie. Hi, everyone. I'm Mingzi. I work at Allen & Overy, and so it's very fitting that I'll be talking about banking and finance law, which is a huge sort of area, and I think it generally can, from my perspective, the way it intersects with climate change, you can talk about the capital markets guys who are doing stuff with green bonds, green securitizations. You can talk about project finance, which is actually financing the building of a lot of renewable energy projects, nuclear, CCUS, renewable solar, offshore wind. And then you can also look at the sui generis loans, so anything from leveraged loans to your general corporate purpose loans. And it's the third category of your finance law that I want to look at in two areas. The first is green loans, and the second is sustainability-linked loans. So green loans are loans which have its loan function is directed to a specific green project. So this is governed by the LMA's green loan principles. And basically what you do is you draft out a facility agreement document, you designate in your use of proceeds clause that the proceeds of the loan are going to be directed to fund, a green project. So this could be a renewable energy project, a reforestation project, something to reduce emissions. And that's your green loans. It's quite, sort of specific and niche. But a more innovative and a product with a more wider impact, in my opinion, are sustainability-linked loans. So these are loans that are not necessarily earmarked for a particular kind of project, but rather they can be any loan that is loaned to a corporation, and it could be a general corporate purposes loan, as long as it has a mechanism within that is designed to incentivize the borrower or obligor to deliver on certain ESG criteria and metrics. So this is very versatile. It can be calibrated to multiple kinds of borrowers, multiple different kinds of ESG criteria. And the key mechanism within it is what we call an ESG margin ratchet. So the margin, i.e. the interest, is how much the cost of financing is on the loan. And basically, if the borrower hits certain ESG criteria, the margin goes down, so it becomes cheaper for financing. And if they fail to meet those criteria, the margin goes up, so it becomes more expensive. It's very, very versatile. You can pick whatever ESG underlying metric you want. So you could look at carbon emissions, scope 1 to 3. You could look at increasing the proportion of renewable energy that the company is buying and contracting into. Or you can look at even supply chain obligations or broader social governance obligations. And then you set your targets and you peg the interest margin in the clause to that target. And there's sort of lots of bells and whistles around it. Usually it comes with reporting and disclosure obligations. Those obligations have third-party verification requirements tied to it. And all of this is usually coordinated by what we call a sustainability coordinator, which is usually one of the banks already involved in the financing, but just pulls together all of these reports and does the negotiation of the ESG metrics. So that's just one small snapshot on how banking and finance law, which is not usually linked to net zero climate change issues, can actually be very, very impactful and scale very rapidly by applying something that's very sort of market and borrower specific, and it can drive these very important goals. Thank you very much. And I'm going to finish off with an area that I think affects all of us sort of in our
daily life, which is real estate and the built environment, and how it both impacts climate change through the materials it uses and the energy, waste, etc., and is impacted by climate change through things like earthquakes, more persistent flooding, inordinate heating, which one of my colleagues covered earlier. But to keep it short and sweet, as a real estate lawyer, you're often dealing with clients who have very extensive commercial points in place that they want to put, that they want to progress, and they come to you and say, oh, we want to deal with X, Y, and Z on a climate change front. And a lot of the time they come to you with things like, we've decided to have a green development plan. How do we make sure that the contractors put this into place properly? So that might be things like the contractors have to sign up to a carbon budget. It might be that they have to explain and disclose how they're getting rid of their waste, both in terms of water, in terms of air pollution, etc. It might be that you're thinking of ways to make sure there are obligations connected to sort of an uplift in their fees or a downgrading of their fees based on whether they're able to show a reduction in their carbon impact, a reduction on their environmental impact. You might want disclosures from your contractors or from your suppliers to show how they are considering their biodiversity impact within the supply chain, especially in relation to the materials that they're using. And most importantly now, I think, given the changes that we're seeing in the climate and the impact it's having on current buildings, how to use materials and innovative designs to make sure that these buildings continue to be resilient in the future, or use methods, for example, for absorbing rainwater, to reduce flooding. So there's a range of things that you can deal with on the real estate front as a lawyer, which initially you don't think about, that make a massive impact given the size of the built environment.
And now it's over to all of you. We would encourage you to turn to your neighbours to discuss this question. And for our attendees on Zoom, we're about to put you into some breakout rooms. So bonus points for everyone who talks to people they don't know before. Do discuss what areas of law have you studied or practiced in, and how do you think climate is currently or will impact it? And beyond that, what is the responsibility of us as lawyers to be advising on these sort of topics and risks? So I'm going to, again, very high-tech, set my iPhone timer for 4 minutes for you all to discuss this. And please, we'd love it if one or two of you could feed back to us afterwards what you've discussed. So I will start my timer now.
You can see the next slide. Slides
Okay, thank you so much. That is 4 minutes. Thank you all. Do we have any brave volunteers to give us their brief impact snapshots of an area of law that they discussed? Go on, spirit of bravery of the youth and all that. Yeah, thank you.
So I just said, and I don't work in this area, but I've studied it, refugee law, because the UN still refuses to recognise climate refugees. They call them climate migrants to imply some sort of choice, and the definition is still very much based on persecution and torture, which just doesn't fit the whole climate issue completely. So there's going to have to be a whole reconceptualization of that. So, yeah.
Brilliant, thank you for that. Anyone else from the other side of the room? Thank you. Yes.
And I do insurance work, so it's kind of the invisible hand that happens everywhere. And we see a lot of things happening in terms of plastic, which we eat, we drink it. A lot of people coming about this, and those big companies, I'm sure somehow. So they're getting Berlin to have things happening in Europe, bringing about potential that's just forever. Ensure these large support companies and the supply chain. So it spans quite a wide area.
Perfect, thank you so much. And we'll take one more in the back there, Jeanette, if you don't mind.
Hello. Right, okay. Right, take two. Right. My name is Sagar. I was speaking with the three ladies behind me. I'm no litigation expert, but I'm expert in the supply chains, studying them all the way from Congo to India to the UK and via China. And my question was, being someone from India, from that region, where the resources we are mining. Yeah, we are mining the coal. Everyone knows India's done massive trade deals of coal with the Aussies, but the resource no one actually seems to be paying much attention to is where my religious and spiritual forests have been completely disheveled. When I look at the mining spots and the water's been completely dehydrated and the women displaced and raped, one every 15 minutes in India, I looked at the resources. I was like, wow, this isn't coal. Oh, what is it? Oh, it's lithium, it's cobalt, it's bauxite. Right, so what's it made into? Electric cars, wind turbines, solar panels. So my question is when all these funds are being invested in by the likes of BlackRock and Vanguard and State Street as well, where is the sustainability in this? Because in all of these rooms, I'm seeing only 1% of the room which is looking like me, with the lived experience and the right to talk about it. But the laws and the impositions is basically saying we want renewables which are coal-free. Roll check. You can't make renewables without burning coal. This is a basic Google search for the last 20 years. So I don't know where this deluded notion is coming from that renewables are coal-free and wind turbines, solar panels, and electric cars are not doing any harm to the planet. We never gave anyone around the world to mine up our lands for these Green New Deal net zero solutions. So litigation-wise, the migrants coming here because our land has been destroyed, they've got nowhere else to go. Litigation-wise, which one of the lawyers in this room will help me and my community not take the coal companies to task, but will take the wind turbine companies and solar panels and electric companies to task for litigation libel cases? Who will help me in this room to actually go against the very grain of their own beliefs for the last 10 years that these renewables are sustainable? Not a jot. And this is what we need to talk about. Women are raped, as I said, 4 every hour, 2 in the mine. And our forests are completely destroyed. But I've not been able to find one person paying attention to this unless they're from my neck of the woods in the global south. Thank you.
Thank you so much for highlighting that. Thank you. Yes, please, Margarita.
Because I think you make a really important point, and there is litigation that is going on. One that I can think of is brought by an organisation called Natural Justice in Africa, and it's exactly the same problem you speak about, which is investment in renewables that has adverse human rights impact on communities. It is possible to litigate on that basis. It's also possible to use court mechanisms like the OECD guidelines to raise complaints about what's going on and lack of compliance with the guidelines on multinational enterprises. And I think you're exactly right by saying we're just moving from one crisis to the next. And I just wanted to, what you said made me think back of about a launch event that I went to recently of a group called Systemic Justice that litigates on a strategic basis. And one woman who was speaking there was speaking exactly about the EV problem, which is we've identified an issue, which is we're consuming too many fossil fuels. The solution to that issue continues to be determined by a minority of people in the global north, tendentially. And the solution is we're just going to move to electric vehicles, as opposed to thinking, should we be reducing demand? Should we be moving away from vehicles in the first place, especially in urban centers, moving to pedestrianization, to cycling? And so it's about changing issues systemically and not falling into the error of adopting the same majority perspectives that have caused human rights violations in the past and are doing so again. So point entirely taken. Very happy to have a conversation about this later, if you'd like to.
Thank you, Margarita, and I'll hand over to Hattie at that point.
I don't know how to move the slides on. Sorry. Oh, this one. Sorry. Okay, great. We're there. Okay, so we're now going to pass back over to you again for another small group discussion, this time about climate change and your experiences of how climate change conversations, topics arose, or perhaps more likely did not arise in your legal education. This is really an opportunity to chat to each other, but also to really get into, I mean, one of the key purposes for why we all thought this group was really important, as Jeanette set out at the top of tonight. And I think we've put some questions on here for you to consider in this conversation, but please don't feel wedded to them or bound by them. It's really interesting to think about legal education broadly, so whether that's your undergrad or your postgrad or even continuing professional development and the ways in which climate change might come up but perhaps doesn't there. There's a really interesting recent paper that came out of Durham University around the need for climate change to be embedded across the core legal curriculum and the ways in which that might be done. And some really interesting commentary there on, for instance, the fact that perhaps the Climate Change Act 2008 is constitutional in its status. And so for that reason, regardless of whether you're an environmental lawyer or any other kind of lawyer, you really need to know about the impacts that this sort of legislation is having. The need for climate conscious reasoning in judgments as well. So with that in mind, I'm going to ask you again to turn to each other. You've all probably introduced yourself by now. Again, it would be really great if anyone has any thoughts at the end or any reflections on how climate change was embedded in their education, or perhaps not. And also any areas of law that you think, actually, no, there is a place for it here, whether that be contract or tort or land. Be really interesting to hear from you. And I know that this is a kind of developing area generally that people are thinking about. So I'll give you 5 minutes to chat and then 5 minutes-ish for feedback at the end. Go ahead. Okay, time is up. You've had longer than 5 minutes. It feels like there's a lot to say on this topic.
Oh, hello?
I need a little glass. Okay, guys, I'm going to ask some people who are happy to contribute their thoughts. We've got our mic runners. So yeah, any initial responses to these questions, any thoughts or reflections or personal stories that anyone wants to share? See, you try to go first.
Sure. So I did a law degree and there wasn't much about climate change apart from a small part of an environmental module. Then I did a master's entirely about environmental law, and it was the only thing I thought about for a year. And what I was really surprised about was when I started training to be a solicitor is that it's so quick to be siloed in the work that you're doing on a day-to-day basis, that there's no sort of onboarding about any of these issues. I know, for example, at UCL for undergrads now, they have kind of a 2-day course, or maybe it's a week course about climate change and the importance that that's going to bear for them in their degree and going forward. And I think about the onboarding that we did when you start to train to be a solicitor and you have kind of a week about business management and professional ethics, and at no point during that week was there a mention of climate change. And then I think about all the different impact snapshots that we looked at, and I'm training at a firm that does employment law, we do human rights law, we have competition law, so consumer protection, we do real estate, we do banking and finance. So if this impacts all of those different sectors, having some sort of onboarding right at the beginning of the kind of training process, I think gets these conversations flowing, because it's not, the problem's not everyone in this room, it's the people who aren't even aware that this is impacting their practice or might impact their practice.
Yeah, thank you. And I think as well, as a young lawyer or a junior lawyer, it can be harder to start those conversations. So it can be really helpful if that is introduced sort of from on high, as this is something that we care about, this is something that's important to us as a firm, but also to our clients, and this is why it matters. But if at the start you don't have that conversation, then how do you ever pick up the thread, because it was never there? So yeah, I think that's a really interesting point about the way that we train our lawyers, whether whether it's for solicitors or barristers, and how these conversations can be embedded at the beginning of practical training as well as academic education. So thanks very much. Anyone else got any reflections? Yes? Would you like a mic?
Thank you. So I felt obliged to say something because me and Sarah did sit through the course from UCL on Law's Connections on climate change. So we did go through the Paris Agreement. I think we went through the Climate Change Act 2008 as well, and it was really great. There was a 8-to-1 tutorial group, and I was sat next to someone who had worked with Client Earth on litigation on the Climate Change Act 2008. So it was really great. But I do think that even though this type of onboarding process is really important, it's more important to integrate that into the rest of the degree, because I think feedback from peers was just that after that first 2 weeks, there was nothing else on it. And some people even preferred to have it, intro us into examinable topics as well. So I think integrating it into the course in that way would be more meaningful and would force people to, study the ratios more and think about it in a less shallow way.
Because currently at UCL, we do have an environmental law module in third year, but it's optional. And I think I heard that it's quite broad-based, so it can be quite confusing sometimes, or it's not a very in-depth introduction to certain topics. And for taught law, we do have a special segment on environmental law, but again, it's optional, it's opt-in, and people can choose a lot of other optional modules to go for within taught. So it's very much self-perpetuating because only people who are interested in it will actually take these lessons in the first place.
Yeah, exactly. When actually, as we know, this matters for everybody. I think as well, in that paper that I mentioned, we can maybe share a link or something. There's a really interesting conversation about whether embedding climate change issues in legal education is ideological or not. And I think there's probably quite a lot to be said around that. But it's really interesting that UCL are already giving that option within tort, right? So it's not like I'm going to do environmental law. It's kind of a different lens, and I think that's where we kind of need to be getting, but feels really far away, but perhaps not quite so far away, given that experience. So thank you. Anybody else? Yeah. Oh, okay. So if we go to the front and then over here.
Cool, thank you. I actually had the same point to say as the two UCL girls, so I've had to improvise my next point. But I also did a law degree, and environmental law was an optional module, and my point was it should be embedded in it should become how do you say it, compulsory module, and also be part of one of the sections of other modules. But anyway, moving on into a legal career, I was at a bigger firm prior to the current firm where I'm doing my training contract, and I'm in a smaller law firm at the moment. And I found that something that I didn't think about earlier in my career was the fact that as trainees, paralegals, or junior lawyers, we have to educate our supervisors and people higher up in the food chain, pardon the pun, on climate change. And I found it was a really difficult conversation to have because it can be a new concept depending on how old your supervisors are. It's true. And it's a hard conversation to have because, especially as a trainee, you're only there for 2 years and there's so much impact that you can make, but it also impacts as a trainee's day-to-day life, and they see you as a disruptor. And you're talking about protesting and having some form of impact. I've had to do numerous trainings where I am, and I've only been training for 1 year, and some of them are basic common sense and such, like printing less. This is honestly DocuSign forever, and other stuff is more complex, like employment contracts. How can we advise clients in that space to integrate more ESG and net zero concept into their own problems? So following from their point, I think it is important that education is carried through at all stages, and it forms part of our ethics and the duty that solicitors have to provide a better advice for their clients. So it should carry through in terms of like our competence and the records that we have to keep for ourselves, and not have trainees tell you what to do.
Thanks so much. I mean, and really great to hear your experiences and the fact that you do feel empowered to have those conversations with people more senior than you. And it sounds as though you're being listened to. And I think that that's like a really great reflection experience to share with everyone in this room. Everyone can kind of take that forward and be inspired by the fact that you have stood up and been like, maybe use DocuSign. That's really, really great, and like quite practical advice there. So thanks very much.
Hattie, can I just add
Yeah.
something to that? Marini, I think that's a very good point, and the way I have approached it is through responsibility. So I'm responsible for doing my job well, right? And you do your job well. Like, you're educated, you're trained, you're a great lawyer. And you don't have the voice because you are not yet senior enough. But the senior you are doing the great job for has the voice, and they have a responsibility towards you to help you progress throughout your career and to make sure that you will succeed in the world that will come. And I think that kind of dual responsibility, if you communicate it, or if we all communicate it as, I'm doing my job, so you do yours, can be quite empowering.
Thanks, Netta. Okay, I think we'll have one more comment, or maybe maybe 2, maybe 3. But we are getting on. So I'm going to go, if we go to the front first.
Thank you. Just to start, Hattie, thank you to all of you for setting this up and having the success of this evening. It's fantastic, and we've had such engaging conversations. One of the conversations we had actually piggybacked from a comment you made, Hattie, which was that we need more climate conscious reasoning and judgments. And that is related, of course, to legal education and exposure to climate change, and a perception, I think, that there is an absence of that exposure and education in our judiciary. This is a question really, which is, what does climate conscious reasoning and judgments look like? It doesn't, from my perspective, look like a judgment that I read today, which sandwiched 214 paragraphs with a paragraph at the top that said, we're in a climate crisis, it's really serious, we're in the red zone, and at the bottom said, but nothing in this judgment should be seen to detract from the fact that we're in a climate crisis and then we're in the red zone. And then there were 214 paragraphs that paid no attention at all to it and seemed to ignore climate change entirely, even though that was the substance of the case.
Yeah.
What do you think climate conscious reasoning looks like?
Well, not like that. But it is really hard, right? Because the law is the law, and a judge will interpret it in the way that they think is correct. I mean, I think that we see through various groups sort of attempts to train judges, to bring judges up to speed with what's actually going on and what the reality is. And the truth is that probably a forum not so unlike this one is needed in this country for our judiciary to really ensure that climate change, as I kind of reflected earlier, isn't seen as an ideological issue. But it's really hard because from what you said in the judgment that you described, it's not being seen as an ideological issue. It's being seen in the reality that we all know exists. So then I guess the question comes back to, well, how can the law be interpreted in a way which is broader or a way which is more beneficial to these issues? But it's not, I don't think it's an easy question. And I don't think it's necessarily one that we can answer in this room, but clearly these conversations need to be happening across the legal profession. And we're starting with the people we know and what we know. But hopefully these conversations can happen elsewhere as well. And that will embed some different approach to reasoning. Can hang it over to Maggie.
One point about the judiciary, because I think it's really interesting, and I think there's a huge difference between common law systems and civil law systems. Because where I'm from in Italy, you can become a lawyer or you can become a judge when you're very young, and so it means that you don't have to go through the whole spiel of become a barrister usually and then become a judge. And I think that really changes the way judges approach the law and decision making. And an example that I thought about immediately is about a young justice in Brazil called Justice Martins da Rosa, and she set up an organization called Jus Clima. And essentially, what they do, she did this because she handed down a judgment several years ago, which had environmental aspects, but she just didn't see the climate change point, the relevance of the climate change point. And then afterwards, she realized that she really missed a very relevant factual circumstance that should have played a part in her judgment. So she went on and she's now doing a PhD on climate-related matters. And she set up this project where the judiciary in Brazil keep an eye out for judgments coming out across the world on climate-related matters. They take them in, get them translated, they summarize them, and they have a judge-held database which informs them about how other judges are reasoning in similar cases around the world. And climate change being such a cross-border issue, I think that's a really interesting idea about a very soft form of climate consciousness, where all that judges are doing are alerting themselves to aspects that might be relevant to their decision making and doing their utmost to educate themselves about it. So I think that's one example of potential climate consciousness.
Yeah, and I guess it's coming down to education, raising awareness. I'm conscious of the time, so I think we might wrap up and move on to our closing and next steps, but we're obviously all here afterwards, so very happy to talk to you more about any of this over drinks. I'm going to hand over to Mingzi now, who's going to do our closing for us.
Thanks very much, Hattie. Next slide. Let's see if this is going to work for me. Oh, it's not working for me. Does someone mind? Yeah, so moving on, I'm just going to give you a quick overview of the structure of our knowledge sessions. Each knowledge session will have 3 components: the first one is the presentation, second, and then an interview, and then some creative content. The presentation will be given by a member of the Legal Voices and cover something substantive in their respective areas of expertise. At least for this year, as Janetta mentioned, we want to focus on climate change, building on COP27 and the urgency of the matter. But moving forward, hence our name, Legal Voices for the Future, we are very much open to expansion, so looking at biodiversity, just transition issues, so on and so forth. Second, the interview will be with a guest speaker, and they'll probably have, they will have practical and academic experience, and hopefully will contextualize the content that was just presented. And then finally, we'll be asking participants to do a bit of homework. That will be a piece of creative media. So you'll be listening to a podcast or maybe reading a chapter of a book, watching a short film. And this will feed into a little bit of small group discussions with a facilitator, and also double up as a chance for you to get to know each other a bit more and discuss things in the round. So what I'd like to do next is to introduce the first few learning sessions of the year. Next slide, please. So the first session will be by Hattie on integrating environmental issues. And this session will invite us to consider whether, and if so, how lawyers, regardless of our specialism or practice area, can and should integrate environmental issues into our work. We'll be looking at a bit more on the government legal side and how departments work together for environmental protection, and also discuss the environmental principle of integration, which sort of underpins all of this good work. Then in March, Elnaz will be taking us through corporate responsibility and climate change. And this is very topical given the raft of regulation from the UK and the EU on disclosure obligations, the alphabet soup of SFDR, TCFDs, etc. And as well as interesting topics on shareholder activism and investor pressure that companies are facing. In April, Margarita will be talking to us on strategic climate litigation. Now, this will be not a very jurisprudential session. It'll be quite practical. It'll be talking about what strategic climate litigation is, how you build a case, how you get it through to filing, what considerations are important when thinking strategically. So, concepts like movement lawyering, community-centric lawyering. It will be very interactive with lots of case studies, so do look out for that. Next slide, please. So just whizzing through, Matilda will be talking us through how to draft contracts that are aligned with net zero. Janetta will be covering greenwashing, another very pertinent and topical topic. And myself, I'll be looking at renewable energy and low carbon in the UK. And then after that, the floor is open to you. So any member of Legal Voices is more than welcome to submit a proposal for your knowledge session and then run it. The 6 of us will, of course, offer our support in terms of the prep work, rehearsing the session. But please do feel free to sort of ideate in these first 6 months and then submit your pitch to us after that. As mentioned by Janetta in her opening speech, membership is open to junior lawyers, and this is a very intentionally flexible category. So solicitors, barristers, not barriers, very much not a barrier. People in the legal services, law students are more than welcome, and as stated, we want to be as open and inclusive as possible. So we believe that anyone can define what young means to them. Next slide, please. So do keep in touch. We're responsive over email, LinkedIn, which is probably quicker, and you can find out more on our website with the Law Society. So I'll shortly pan back to Alistair for his closing remarks, but do please scan the QR codes to either leave feedback on this session, sign up as a member, or sign up for our first knowledge sessions. And before you do leave, I'd just like to ask you to tick off your name off the register by the tables behind, just so we know you came, and also to email us any photos you do take of this event, because we are not rich enough to have hired a photographer. Thank you very much. Handing over to Alistair.
Well, I don't think there's really much that I can add. I mean, to be honest, I've already in that session alone learned a lot. I'm really looking forward to genuinely attending those sessions and taking away the feedback from them. The energy in the room tonight, in terms of the engagement from everybody here, frankly, very rare, and I go to a lot of these, like a lot. So I think it's fantastic. We've already got, the runway for a lot of, fantastic conversations, knowledge sharing ahead for actions, as I was speaking about, to be generated. Just quickly touching on very briefly the two questions which were made. First one was discussing competency issues for solicitors. This is a vital area that all solicitors need to be thinking about, more so now than just a nice to do. And the Law Society are in the process of thinking about how we might support that through guidance for all solicitors. So keep an eye on that. And secondly, as well, to do with legal education. The competency of a solicitor is based upon the average practitioner. As the expectations of the profession increase, as the net zero agenda becomes more mainstream, or however you want to term it, solicitor, you're not going to be able to get by on what the lady said on the front row with regards to being inertia on this issue, really, frankly. So, these sort of conversations are the trailblazer, but they're absolutely vital and really needed. And I just say a massive, massive congratulations to you guys. I know how hard they've worked on this, truly fundamentally, and they've done a phenomenal job. And yeah, really fantastic. So I think everybody should give them a massive round of applause.